Education Manager. And today we're going to be talking about, as the expert, we're going to be talking about trees for dry condition. And our speaker today is Greg Levine, our co-executive director here at Trees Atlanta. Our mission at Trees Atlanta is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests by planting, conserving, and educating. We host programs, educational programs year-round, virtual, but also in person. During this virtual event, please use the Q&A button to submit questions. You can also use the chat to send any comments or share any resources with the other participants. We will be answering and discussing the questions live. After this program, when the virtual webinar ends, you're going to be receiving a survey. It's going to be popping into your screen, but we are also going to be sending a survey email. We'd love to hear from you. How was your experience? What type of topics would you like us to bring to the community into this format or in person? Please don't forget to send us your feedback. And if you're not doing so, I'll invite you to sign up for our newsletter. Check out the upcoming events and opportunities, including educational programs and also volunteer opportunities at treesatlanta.org. And for you to follow us on different social media networks. And I'd like to tell you about the annual tree sale that's coming up. It's going to be on October 8th at the Catter Center. It's going to be an in-person sale. And we're going to have a variety of trees. And we're going to be focusing on dry and upland species. For more information, visit treesatlanta.org/tree sale, where you're going to find the list of trees that we're going to be selling. And just here a note for everybody. We're located right now in our headquarters in Reynoldstown, but we are going to be moving to Oakland City. So check it out in our website, the information of where we're going to be moving. It's 825 Warner Street, and the renderings and more information of how Trees Atlanta is moving. So now with you, I'm going to leave our co-executive director. Thank you, Greg, for being here with us.
Thank you, Michelle. So I am the co-executive director of Trees Atlanta, and I'm really excited to hear about your questions on the on what drought tolerant species. And I think you'll be surprised about how many things are drought tolerant. We have a huge list of plants that are available at the sale, but some things I mention we don't have that are also drought tolerant that that you might be interested. But it doesn't have to be, all of our questions don't have to be around just drought tolerant plants. If there's some other questions you might have, I'm happy to answer them. And it doesn't have to be about trees, because we do have a lot of shrubs as well, and some vines and other things.
Hey, Greg, would you start sharing with us why did Trees Atlanta pick this theme, the dry and upland species?
Well, so there's a few reasons why we picked dry and upland species. First of all, people are getting more and more interested in not having to water as much. We also, our weather is changing quite a bit, where we do get longer extended drought with then flooding. So we had that for kind of looking out future. But interesting enough too, a lot of our upland trees that are drought tolerant, we aren't seeing them as much in our city as we used to. And there's a lot of reasons for that. They tend to be slightly more difficult to plant and transplant. So the ball burlaps are difficult to move. They typically are slower growers, so people don't want them as much. But they also, because they're slower growers, when they're in urban areas, they're not regenerating as well, either because they stay smaller longer and more likely to be destroyed by people or animals, or because people just aren't propagating them because they don't make sense for the nursery trade to grow. So all those reasons why we really want to focus on getting some of our upland species back into our urban environment. And that's not just Atlanta, but it's suburban environments. There's actually some studies now showing a lot of or lack of regeneration of many of our oak trees. But I think that's also showing up with other species as well.
Greg, you mentioned nurseries. What would you talk a little bit about what nurseries are we partnering with, and like how old are the trees that we're going to be selling at the sale?
So I didn't quite catch that second part of your question, but I'll start with the first. We are ordering this year from about 10 nurseries. It seems like every year, unfortunately, another I think we had 2 nurseries closing down this year. So we're always having to look for new nurseries. It's I think a lot of people who are doing retirement more than, and we had one nursery, they had a flood that washed out their entire stock, and they were like, all right, I'm just retiring early. So we have, and those nurseries are everywhere from Florida to the Carolinas, Tennessee. I think we might have one from Alabama. So pretty far out. And we have one that's very far north. I think it might be New Jersey. And most of those are cultivars, not the native genotype. So they're cultivars that they grow that are more difficult to find, because we do look for a lot of challenging cultivars or new cultivars that have better characteristics than the straight species for landscape.
How old are usually the trees that we sell?
So we'll have trees from a 1 to 15 gallon size. 1 gallon trees usually are about 2 years old, whereas a 3 might be 2 to 3 years old, and going up to 7 and 15. Those are usually at least 3 years old. Sometimes for some of the slower species, like a beech tree or hickory, they can often be, 5 to even 6 years old. Again, it all depends on the gallon size, but no trees less than 2 years really. Takes a year for it to sprout and become anything, and you really want another year of growth.
So we got a question from one of the attendees. Will there be any small height drought tolerant, so less than 20 feet, drought tolerant or not, single trunk tree for sale in October?
Yeah, we will have a couple so there's dwarf chinkapin oak, which is very dwarf. If they're pure dwarf chinkapin, they range anywhere from 6 to 18 feet. But I can tell you, I planted one in a neighbor's yard about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's still about 5 feet tall. When you have some of the smaller trees, it takes them a long time to get there. Hop tree is a very drought tolerant tree. We will also have, there's and I think slightly bigger than what you're talking about, maybe more in the 30-foot range. You have Ostrya, Ostrya, or hop hornbeam, another really great drought tolerant species. And they grow pretty slow. So I could say every time we've planted one, it takes about 20 years for it to get to 20 feet. They tend to be, the slower drought tolerant trees tend to be slow growers. Another one that I really love, I'm not sure we're going to have it, and it stays about 10 feet to 12, is Vaccinium arboreum or sparkleberry. It's semi-evergreen. They get kind of a nice, kind of like a Japanese maple Asian bonsai look, and they're very tough once they get established. So it's a really pretty one that you can prune into a lovely kind of, again, you'd almost imagine it in a Japanese garden, even though it is a native species. One of the other ones, it's a small drought tolerant tree is Quercus pumila, which is dwarf oak. It's a crawling oak or creeping oak. It gets only about 6 feet, and it makes kind of a mass, like an oak mass for those that might want to feed the caterpillars. It's a great tree for that. We don't have that many of them. Since I'm talking about, probably should add a couple on there in case my staff's listening. It is a good drought tolerant species that stays small. There are a number of others, and I'm looking through my list real quickly to make sure I didn't miss anything that's in that small level. We're going to have some Asian pine trees that kind of a specialty, more for that kind of look for maybe you want a Japanese garden, just trying to break it up a little bit. So you want to have some of those. The pine trees are pretty much all drought tolerant. Virginia pine tends to stay small. It's one of our native pines, and it gets to be 25, can get 35 under the best conditions. Not much taller than that in the best conditions. We have myrtle oak, which is an turkey oak, which are upland dry species. They need to stay dry though. They don't like to ever be wet, and they definitely stay under 30 feet. Turkey oak's a real funky one. I really like it because the leaves have a kind of a very coarse texture, and because they grow in very hot upland places, their leaves can actually turn. So when it's really hot, they'll actually move. So they're not getting that baking sun on them. Whereas the myrtle oak is just another oak that can get a very refined shape, coarse textured. It's more of a middle Georgia tree than Piedmont, so it's turkey oak. But we see those in uplands, and they do grow well here. There's a turkey oak I planted in Oakhurst about 20 years ago, and it's sitting at about 20 to 25 feet tall. That's a lot of answers for, maybe you want more description on any of those, I can certainly do it. But I can tell you about the uniqueness of it. If anybody on the call would like to know any of the uniqueness, I'd be happy to talk about any of those species more. The last thing I might mention, and we're throwing them all out there, they're under 30 feet. Most of the palm trees, the native palms, whether it be palmetto or needle palm, they're fairly drought tolerant, even though you see them in floodplains. And I'd say needle palm is even more drought tolerant. We have needle palms that have been growing in our containers outside our building, and they're about 5 feet tall, and they've been in these containers for 16 years. I don't think we do much subsidizing water in a container. So they're a pretty good kind of smaller plant that would also work.
Okay. Yeah. So now looking to a question from a homeowner, what kind of privacy trees grow the tallest, fastest, sound buffer, and are the best type of trees for homeowner backyard that's near a major intersection?
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
They want to be native too.
Private trees that grow tallest, fastest, sound buffer near a major intersection.
All right, so when you have evergreen is what you're basically talking about. When we have evergreen trees, they're also going to be blocking, which is a visibility thing. So you got to think about that when you're planting them. The number one tree that comes to my mind is going to be red cedar. I like red cedars because they are native, and they do a little bit more for wildlife. To me, that's probably the ultimate tree for what you're looking for, because they also come in straight species, which will be varying in heights, or you can buy a selection or a cultivar. I'm not sure we have one. I'm looking at it right now. But if not, we definitely probably need to get a cultivar. We have a cultivar called Gray Owl that is more of a shrub. It's going to be out in 8 or 9 feet tall. But there's cultivars called Brody and Berkey that are more irregular. The straight species will work fine. You're just not going to get the same shape. If you want the same shape over and over and over again, you'd want a cultivar with that. So that'd be my number one selection. I think other, wax myrtle for a shorter one is fairly drought tolerant. They do live in floodplain areas, but once the wax myrtle is established, they usually can handle drought. And they get only to be about 12 feet tall, and they are pretty quick growers. I think one of the problems with them is that in ice storms, they can tend to break. Other, more shrub-like things, they could do the non-native osmanthus or the American osmanthus, which we also have. Osmanthus will make a nice hedge for you. What I like to see, just for diversity's sake, and in case one doesn't do well, is you're mixing a couple or 3. So they could do a combination of cedar, maybe mix in some of the evergreen osmanthus, and even add to that, or the red cedar shrub as well. But I like for a long-term hedge, because you eventually end up getting more shade and it won't be as much full sun, is to add in some of our American holly selection. Because the American holly tends to be slow, but it lives long. And if you're diversifying, your red cedar starts to fade out, you'll have your American holly still there. So I like the combination of a red cedar, American holly. And if you want to add in osmanthus for that thick evergreen and some fragrance, that would work pretty well. If you wanted a big evergreen tree, you know, the one tree that we have is the live oak, which we all love. It's going to give you a little bit of break, you know, between the top branch and the trunk, but you're going to have that mass of the branching of the live oak. And they're quite beautiful and they get really broad. I don't even know how many we ordered, but they're lovely. Everyone loves them. And I think with the climate issues that we have, it could be a good possibility there. And I know that they do well here. I planted them 25 years ago, and actually they're in front of Kroger on Monroe Drive, and they're still there blocking recycling and garbage cans right there on Monroe Drive. And they've done there's other locations we planted them, but those stick out in my brain. So that, yes, live oak can work for that too.
That's great. And I really like what you're suggesting about having different species and how can they like grow together through the years. It's good. Okay, so I have another question here. I have a couple of trees, redbud and ginkgo, that cannot for the life of me get to grow up higher. They both are growing prolifically outward, but not much higher. I tried staking and pruning with some, but not enough.
Okay, so the thing with ginkgos, and I don't know if you bought a cultivar, some cultivars have that weird sideways growth. I'm thinking about this one that starts with an F. I can't remember the name of it at the top of my head. Somebody can pop it up there. And one that starts with an S, that both tend to do a lot of this. And they never, actually was behind the Metropolitan, I don't know, the Metropolitan Apartments over there on Peachtree Street. And I don't know if somebody topped those ginkgos or if they got one, Saratoga might be one of them. Or if they got one of those varieties that wants to do this, they just do that. And there's a lot of ginkgo cultivars that are selected for all kinds of reasons. And some of them were selected to be under power lines. And if you have that, that's why they tend to do that kind of and stay smaller. It could be a straight species. And if it's a straight species, then it could be the genetics of that particular ginkgo, because ginkgo genetics, because there's only one species, as opposed to cultivar, they have a lot of variation in ginkgos. And it could be just a straight species and it's doing its own thing, but it could be a dwarf. I bought a ginkgo for a friend 20 years ago. He's not on it's not his question, I don't believe, but I saw it and I'm like, the thing's still like 4.5 feet tall. I'm like, what did I buy them? Or it's just doesn't like the soil situation. So it sits there like a bonsai. So it could be a soil situation. Other things that might cause a tree not to grow well or tall are that they got planted too deeply. And you could try excavating around the trunk and making sure that that top root is pretty close to the top of the soil. If not, I've done this in trees on my street where I've literally excavated the dirt until I found that top root, and it does this around the trunk, the ground layers like this, and it drops. I'd rather see that than have dirt piled up around the trunk. So it could be those different things for the ginkgo. It could be selection type. It could be straight species. It could be that you planted it too deeply. Any of those things. Tupelo, same thing, could be planted too deeply, or it's got circling roots that you really can't fix now, but you could still try to excavate, make sure that top root is there. So what I've done with Tupelo, because sometimes if it's a straight species, they do often genetically want to do this. And the height, that it could be genetically, they don't want to be tall, or it could be Tupelo just really slow. I mean, I've talked about with some of our regular tree people that Tupelo could almost be under power lines because half of them don't want to grow tall. And then the other, but now there have cultivars that do get a good leader. So my answer on the Tupelo is, it could be it's not a cultivar, it doesn't want to have a leader, or it could be some root issues underground. So what would I do besides excavate? If it's been there a long time, I might give up on it or just say, oh, I'm going to have a bonsai of a Tupelo and a ginkgo. Some things you can do are when you've got this leader, right, and it's going to all these side places, pushing in those side branches is called branch reduction. I see Stephanie's on this call, Stephanie Coffin, which she knows this. If you push in these side branches, sometimes, and not cutting them off, but reducing them to another branch and reducing them so that you're trying to push this in to what sends up a leader. If you remove them completely, you're taking off too much food. You want to reduce them by 1/3 or 2/5, all of those side branching, and hopefully it'll push up a leader. Ginkgo might work that way for ginkgo. I wouldn't push them in by 2/3. I might push them in just by 1/3. So reducing it to another bud. I don't know how that works. Another bud, and that way you're telling the tree, I need to send out growth, but I shouldn't be sending it out to my side, which is what you would do if you're in a forest. Those leaders would get shaded, and for the tree to survive, it would send up the leader. So we're kind of faking out the tree that it needs to send up a leader. If it's a bonsai or if it's a dwarf cultivar, sorry, if you've got a dwarf cultivar. If you bought that from us, hopefully you knew what you were buying.
That's very interesting. Well, we have another question here about more of the health of a tree. So recently we had a tree cut down and the inside was hollow with a black substance. What will cause that?
Rot. I don't know. So many things. So what I can tell you, this is not probably my most knowledgeable expertise, but many trees are hollow, right? Damage happens along their 100 years of growing, and when the branch a branch or wound starts to rot, often the branch will rot to the center of the tree, and the fungus that breaks down the branch can also move into the tree. So a lot of trees are hollow. The black substance could be I couldn't answer that really. It could be anything that fungal that causes the center to rot. It could be there could be a disease. I don't know, but hollowness is not uncommon. I think the problem more than a hollow tree, and people don't want you to be all scared of your hollow trees, and they're not all hollow, but they have some hollow components when a wound has happened. The bigger problem is when the hollow is based on a root system area, and you've got root rot fungal growth, which is galliodermas and things like that, which don't really matter because you talk to an arborist about it. But when you start seeing a lot of fungi growth around that root system, or a lot of fungal growth in a trunk, that is a sign that your trunk and your roots could be turning into mush, basically. One or two of them is not a big deal around the root base, but when they get spread to more than 1/3, or they start to get bigger, more conchs, they call them conchs, the more of them, the more likely you're going to have an issue. And that's when you should have an arborist come, take a look at your trees. And especially if you see a lot of fungal growth on the trunk, a lot of it. I can't remember the name of that one, but that's pretty scary. And yes, you should probably have that tree looked at pretty soon. Usually you see dying when you see the trunk growth, fungals, you see some dying inside the tree canopy. Whereas root fungal growth, you can have a perfectly beautiful canopy, and it could have more problems than you know. But again, I would make that assumption. I would have somebody look at it. They can do tests. I can't remember the name of it. Stephanie might make it pop back up there for me. They can do tests basically with X-ray kind of machines and see what the rot is and if it's soft rot or whatever, to get a sense of how much hollowness you have around the root base. Somebody who works with diagnosing trees every day would be better at answering that than somebody who has known about it and his brain's gotten too full and it's pushed out that information to somebody who actually does it every day.
Yeah, so to find a consultation arborist, check out the Georgia Arborist Association website, definitely. All right, so Greg, what do you think is going to be the most popular tree or plant in the sale?
The ones that so what do you think? What am I going to push? I really,
what's going to be sold out first?
Oh, what sells out first? That's usually your shrubs. We sell a lot of dogwoods and flowering trees pretty quickly. That's pretty common. We have so many different species of oak. We usually don't sell out of oak. But with that said, I'm going to push the oaks onto people. First of all, if you don't have an oak tree in your, I know there's not a lot of people on the call, but if you don't have an oak tree in your yard, or if you have friends and family who don't have an oak tree in your yard, that is a tree that every yard should have, because they feed so many of our caterpillar species, 500 different types of caterpillar species. So to me, if you live in, and we have 33 native oaks to Georgia, I think as much as California or as much as Texas, but not quite as much as California. So we have as many oaks as about any state. The live oak is our state tree. You should have an oak in your yard because of all those reasons. So yes, oaks. But I think also we should start looking, and especially the post oak and the scarlet oak and the southern red oak, which are all dry upland species that we don't see growing naturally as much, which is disappointing in our cities and environments. I love blackjack oak. I don't even know we're selling it. It doesn't look like we are. Not available. But I love blackjack oak. I think it's a weird oddity that's just fantastic. And I have to see why we don't have it. Maybe it's not available. If Dana's on this call, maybe we should put that one in. It's just a weird coarse tree, and you don't see it. And once it gets established, can handle drought for as long as you give it to it. I think what people need to understand with drought trees, tolerant trees, that first couple of years, you can't just plant it and say, I'm done, it's drought tolerant. You still got to get it established, so that watering once, every 10 days is probably what you're going to need to do for that first spring and summer, and maybe just to be safe, that second summer. Other trees that I really would like to see people planting more, hickories. For the most part, the nursery trade doesn't sell hickories. We get them from we have one nursery that grows them. And every year I talk about hickories and we sell like 10 of them. It's disappointing. They do have big nuts, which is one of the problems. I love shagbark hickory. It's one of my favorite hickories. It is slow growing, but I love the way the bark sheds in these big panicle long strips. So I'd say shagbark specifically, but I like all hickories. They have a great yellow color. They do feed squirrels and some birds, and they're just kind of cool. What else would I think would be interesting? I'm looking at my list right now. I think people should think about other trees that aren't necessarily upland trees that are drought tolerant. And I was just talking to actually someone on this call, and we talked about bald cypress. And the cool thing about bald cypress is they can grow in floodplains, and they can also be pretty drought tolerant. So because floodplains, what happens is you have floods, and then they're dry, wet, dry, wet, dry. So if you've got one of those yards that does both, your floodplain species are very good species to plant in that situation. Trees like bald cypress and pond cypress, cherry bark oak is a good one. And tupelo is super in both. It can handle really upland dry, and it can take almost wet as well. So tupelo can take a lot of variance. So I think all those trees are popular to me. As far as shrubs go, and we can go all, those sell anyways, and we're going to talk about them, but things that will sell out quickly are going to be your hydrangeas, always sell out really quickly and people get disappointed. Often our red buckeyes sell pretty quickly. You just never know what's going to be popular. Somebody's there was an article on something or another. I do have a tree that we might have some small ones. If we don't have them now, we're going to have them next spring because we have a contractor that's growing them for us. The Franklinia gordonia cross. Franklinia are really hard to grow. Gordonia are a little easier. I have found the cross between them. It's been in my yard for 10 years and doesn't stop growing. It could be my particular great yard, my super green thumb. But I love that tree. And people who go see it are like, that tree's so great. It blooms from July. It's still blooming today. So it's sending these white flowers with yellow stamens, all, for months. But that's a flowering tree question that you didn't really ask me. So persimmon's a good one for producing the fruit that people often want. And it's fairly drought tolerant too. Last year we had cultivars of it. This year we have straight species and the Asian cultivars as well.
Do you need one or do you need more than one for producing fruit?
The problem with with not having a selection is that the Japanese persimmons, you only need one. They self-pollinate for the most part. Ours are dioecious, so they're female or male. So if you buy two, then you have a better chance of having the female.
Okay.
Usually if you get the female, there's enough persimmon around that don't get pollinated. But it's probably best to buy two.
Mm-hmm.
But one, and take your chance. They're beautiful trees anyway. So in 10 years, it doesn't produce a really beautiful fall color. I think they have a nice dark green leaf. I think they're really cool looking trees, and they are drought tolerant. So it's not the worst thing in the world, but you are taking a 50-50 chance if you only have one. If you have two, then that kind of reduces your, it brings up your, is it 75%? I guess that's how numbers work. I can't remember it. 75% chance you'll have a female in there.
Okay. Cool. So do you want to talk about native plants and grasses and maybe their role in the dry conditions and the selection we're going to be having?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's good to think about the ground plane. You know, where you don't, it's better to have plants than it would be mulch on most of the ground for multiple reasons. Everything from one of the biggest reasons is water retention and getting your water to stay in your own infiltrate in your own groundwater. But where you don't have plants, you have mulch or weeds. So ground cover is super important. I think in sunny spots, most of our grasses are perfect for that, right? They're very drought tolerant. Even muley grass, which is a wetland grass, are all drought tolerant. So grasses in general, and a lot of your perennials are all fairly drought tolerant. We're not having a lot of perennials, so I won't get into those. But we have some perennials, but not a large amount. What's interesting about grasses and perennials, they tend to need more sun. And they really say if you're going to naturalize the whole area, it should be about 60 or more percentage in grass if you want to have a lower maintenance bed, and 40 to 30% perennials, because the grasses kind of take up more room and are more aggressive. The only shady grass that works in mostly sun too is the river oat. And river oat will be slower in sun, but it makes a great ground cover. And it's tough, it's nails. I mean, the only way you can really get rid of it is digging it up or cutting it back about 3 times during the season. But once you have it, you're going to have it for a long time, unless you have really dry soil and it won't reseed as much. Shrub wise is a little more, I like to pretty much keep my shrubs more concerned about them than my trees. But some of the drought tolerant shrubs, oak leaf hydrangea is extremely drought tolerant in shade. It actually doesn't like to be wet and gets more fungal issues. And then we have like 3 or 4 different varieties of oak leaf hydrangea. It can take almost full sun too. Western sun's hot on it. Southwest is hot, but open on the north or open on the east, it can take full sun. It just doesn't want to be wet. So I think that is a really good selection. And there's cultivars that are, from 3 feet tall to 6 or 7 feet tall. Some other shrubs, American euonymus, which is kind of an oddity, is pretty drought tolerant. It's a very strappy, it's our only native euonymus. It's very strappy, like green branches, but it's called heart sebustin and has a fruit that bursts open. It's got pink and orange in it, which makes it kind of fun. I saw it in a photo once, how they espaliated it to a white brick wall. And it was really interesting looking as the green branches up against the white wall and the fruit on top of it. It was pretty unique. It's a nice, unique plant. Fothergilla is fairly drought tolerant if it's got good soil. I think we have one called Mount Airy, and it's been in my parents' yard for 20 something years, and with white oak above it and yellow wood, it's nothing but roots. And that Fothergilla has done quite well competing with those 3 trees. and hackberry too. So it's got everything it's competing with. Bottle brush buckeye is also pretty drought tolerant once it's established. Interesting about bottle brush, it's probably the smallest of our buckeyes. Maybe Georgia buckeye might be smaller, but bottle brush kind of suckers and makes a nice mass. At the Georgia, the garden at Georgia on Lumpkin Street by the Landscape Architecture School, it's an old garden called the Lumpkin Garden or something. They planted it, and in the way that it grows, it kind of grows in an umbrella kind of fashion. They kept it almost as a 2-foot ground cover by just cutting it back every year, and it kind of made this nice little ground cover of bottle brush. So you can keep it at a height, a mass of 5 or 6 feet, or it's pretty easy to keep as this nice low ground cover with a little bit of maintenance, which I think is interesting. And I love that. I love that plant. I mean, I love all the buckeyes. I think it makes it kind of a unique way to grow it. It's pretty easy to do it.
So another question about tree selection. What drought-resistant trees would you suggest for an area you want to screen that needs a very tall 2-story tree? So now we're talking about a very tall tree.
Yeah, you're talking screening. I mean, if you want, really the evergreen screening is going to fall into red cedar, if you want native, American holly, Virginia pine. Pines are fast growers, and Virginia pine tends to be a smaller one. And red cedar can be pretty fast. So those are all going to work. For deciduous trees and you're limited in space, I do like the bald cypress and pond cypress, but they are deciduous conifers, so they're going to lose their leaves. Spruce pine is a beautiful low-branched pine tree. At least it can stay low-branched. It reminds me of white pine, but is a more drought tolerant and heat tolerant. So I love Pinus. I think it's Pinus. Is it strobus or is that white pine? It's gonna come to me in glabra, Pinus glabra. It's a good screener and drought tolerant, and it might fit that situation that you're looking for. It might be a little bit wider than Virginia pine, but Virginia pine is a little shorter lived, but a little more condensed. There is one spruce pine as you go down Freedom Parkway from Ponce, and you cross over Ralph McGill, and there's an area where there's a triangle with one tree in it. And if you go to the right of that triangle, it takes you to North Highland. If you go straight, it takes you to Boulevard. There's one spruce pine that was planted as a 3-gallon about 20 years ago. You can kind of get a sense of how it grows. I love that tree, and most people, when they see them older, really think it's quite nice. Those are the ones I would do. If you don't, you can do Foster eye holly. It tends to be more conical. Osmanthus that can still get, but Osmanthus can get 20 feet tall. There's not I don't know of many dwarf cultivars of Osmanthus. When you're doing it, people are keeping it short. They're hedging them. I love American holly. It's one of my favorite evergreens. You can do some big, some southern magnolias. There are a lot of, we don't have them. We tend to not, because they're so available at nurseries. There's one called Teddy Bear that stays kind of small to 15 feet. And Little Jim stays to about 25 to 30. But if you really should buy a southern magnolia if you want to do it as a particular hedge, as a cultivar, and find the right cultivar. And don't buy the straight species. One more, I got one more. I love. The Magnolia Virginianas are great. We have one that I particularly like. Some people don't think like others better. Jim Wilson or Moonglow is a nice oval shape. It's not dense evergreen. Some of the other ones, new selections might be denser, but I like the shape of it, and it is a fast grower. Drought tolerant, it's average soil tolerance. I wouldn't say it's super drought tolerant.
So we have 2 more questions. I have owned a vacant lot next to my house. What recommendations would you suggest for native planting that give it back to the ecosystem?
Okay. Well,
a vacant lot.
Vacant lot. You want to keep your invasive plants out of there, obviously. So you probably want to look at stuff that tends to, from a shrub level, I would look at things that sucker more. And then tree level, I would go for diversity, right? You would, get the oaks in there, looking at wildlife, hickory. If you want to support some specific butterflies, you can do the tulip poplar and the pawpaw, which support very specific butterflies, caterpillars, which people don't think about trees supporting butterflies, very unique ones. So those are all trees that I would consider doing. Because of maintenance, I like shrubs that sucker. If you want to have shrubs that kind of take over the area, you can do sumacs because they sucker. Sweet shrub tends to sucker quite a bit. That creeping oak might be something you would want to try. I'm looking through my list, just thinking about, if you want habitat, you might think about some things that berry. They don't sucker quite as much, but your deciduous hollies, Ilex verticulata, they tend to sucker a bit, but a bit. They don't like super dry soils though. But they have the berries on them all winter when birds need different, food. I might also suggest aronia, which also creates a berry. You can look at aronia for more suckering type plant types. You want to get that shrub, at least that shrub and tree layer, and that mid-story is nice to have. But if you get some shade, you can actually start planting dogwoods, which do make that winter berry. But dogwoods in full sun tend to struggle at best. Hummingbirds, you can do, there's so many things you can do for wildlife, but I'm thinking about if you have a big lot next door to you, what you want to do is lower maintenance stuff, which is going to be that shrub and tree layer. If you want something to make a ground cover, plant that river oak and get it established, and it will reseed, and you're just kind of removing stuff that aren't the river oak as a ground layer.
All right, so another question. I almost got talked into a Benjamin Franklin tree by a native nursery in Fayetteville. They said they are not found in nature anymore. Any thoughts?
What tree was it again?
A Benjamin Franklin tree.
Oh yeah, that's the Franklinia tree. The other gone in nature, it's true. So my thoughts around that, or if we don't have them this year, we're going to have them next year, and maybe in the spring. That cross between, that I mentioned before, the Franklinia Gordonia cross, is getting close to what the Franklinia looks like, but it's definitely more tolerant to some of the fungal issues that Franklinia gets. The biggest Franklinia I knew of was at the Atlanta History Center, and unfortunately it died, I think a year or two ago. It's like 30 feet. They get a fungus, and I can't remember the name of the fungus. And they think possibly was spread through cotton, which is why it got wiped out. And John Bartram discovered it. By the time his kids or he came back, it was gone in nature. They're still around because John Bartram brought it back to Philadelphia in his garden, and everything comes from that tree. Those trees there now. So there's not a lot of genetic diversity. They're either cuttings or from seed. I love the tree. It's quite lovely, but I've killed it. I don't want to tell you how many times. People would like to try to grow it because it's a challenge, and some people are doing pretty well with it. What I've been told is that you want to definitely have good drainage, and you can look it up, or you can talk to an arborist. There's a fungicide that you can spray on it every few years if you're okay with that. That will keep that fungus, the fungus that kills it, out of the soil. Yes, it's extinct in nature.
Interesting. Well, to wrap up, Greg, what people can expect at our sale?
All right, so we can expect a lot of different plants, some cultivars that we've never had. We're really trying to, find cultivars that from more on shrub side that solves, more of your landscape situation that can work more for those. Often native landscapes are looked at as too wild or whatever. Some of our selections are a little bit more contained of those shrubs to get them back into the nursery trade. So we're looking at all of those. we have a lot of native plants, and we're going to have a lot of experts helping us tell you what might be the right plant for your situation. Our usual, lots of native azaleas. It's pretty good list, and I think it's going to come up this week, and Dana could probably confirm, and Judy, but I think we'll have the list up this week. Also, we're going to have, we're changing it up a little bit this year. For those that don't know, we're going to have our plant sale, and then we're going to have an online sale as well. So we're going to put more plants online, and some of the things that were left over for people who missed the sale, so they can continue to order. We're just changing it up to see how that works well with hopefully COVID a little bit more in the rear view mirror, seeing just changing the hybrid, because in the past years we've been doing order first, sale later. We're going to change it up this year and see how that goes. So support both, but if you can't make the sale, and then you can order online. Literally the Tuesday after the sale, we're going to have it online for about a week or 10 days of plants that we're reordering and some of the leftover stuff too.
Yeah, and I added in the chat the link for more information about the sale, and the list is actually there posted in there for the trees and the plants.
Great. Well, thank you, and everybody. I'm sure Michelle has a few more words, but we appreciate you supporting the sale, and obviously even more supporting planting native trees and planting trees, because everyone should plant a tree this year. I've had discussion with one of the people on the call. Everyone needs to plant a tree this year in their yard, find a place for it. But also, if you can help share it, it's nice to be able to supply plants that can't be found at any of our local nurseries, or not in abundance. But it's also, supporting the organization and our mission. But it's also getting the idea out that there is room to plant in your yard, and that just pushing it along gets people's interest, thinking about native species and diversity, and that yes, with climate issues, we can start fighting that every yard at a time. So talking to your friends and neighbors, putting it on Facebook, and Instagram, whatever you want to do on all those social media things. We appreciate that help too.
Yeah. Thank you for everybody who's in this call. I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. We have more videos like these on like specific species that you might be interested, and just selection in general for the right tree for the right place. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Greg, and everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.